Chapter 3. Price Controls. The record of price controls goes back as far as human history. They were imposed by the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. They were decreed by Hammurabi, king of Babylon in the 18th century BC. They were tried in ancient Athens. Henry Hazlitt. Nothing makes us understand the many roles of electricity in our lives like a power failure. Similarly, nothing shows more vividly the role and importance of price fluctuations in a market economy than the absence of such price fluctuations when the market is controlled. What happens when prices are not allowed to fluctuate freely according to supply and demand, but instead their fluctuations are fixed within limits set by law under various kinds of price controls? Typically, price controls are imposed in order to keep prices from rising to the levels that they would reach in response to supply and demand. The political rationales for such laws have varied from place to place and from time to time, but there is seldom a lack of rationales whenever it becomes politically expedient to hold down some people's prices in the interest of other people whose political support seems more important. To understand the effects of price control, it is first necessary to understand how prices rise and fall in a free market. There is nothing esoteric about it, but it is important to be very clear about what happens. Prices rise because the amount demanded exceeds the amount supplied at existing prices. Prices fall because the amount supplied exceeds the amount demanded at existing prices. The first case is called a shortage, and the second is called a surplus, but both depend on existing prices. Simple as this might seem, it is often misunderstood, sometimes with disastrous consequences. Price ceilings and shortages. When there is a shortage of a product, there is not necessarily any less of it, either absolutely or relative to the number of consumers. During and immediately after the Second World War, for example, there was a very serious housing shortage in the United States, even though the country's population and its housing supply had both increased by about 10% from their pre-war levels. And there was no shortage when the war began. In other words, even though the ratio between housing and people had not changed, nevertheless, many Americans looking for an apartment during this period had to spend weeks or months in an often futile search for a place to live, or else resorted to bribes to get landlords to move them to the top of waiting lists. Meanwhile, they doubled up with relatives, slept in garages, or used other makeshift living arrangements, such as buying military surplus Quonset huts or old trolley cars to live in. Although there was no less housing space per person than before the war, the shortage was very real and very painful at existing prices, which were kept artificially lower than they would have been because of rent control laws that had been passed during the war. At these artificially low prices, more people had a demand for more housing space than before rent control laws were enacted. This is a practical consequence of the simple economic principle already noted in Chapter 2, that the quantity demanded varies according to how high or how low the price is. When some people used more housing than usual, other people found less housing available. The same thing happens under other forms of price control. Some people use the price-controlled goods or services more generously than usual because of the artificially lower price, and as a result, other people find that less than usual remains available for them. There are other consequences to price controls in general, and rent control provides examples of these as well. Demand under rent control. Some people who would normally not be renting their own apartments, such as young adults still living with their parents, or some single or widowed elderly people living with relatives, were enabled by the artificially low prices created by rent control to move out and into their own apartments. These artificially low prices also caused others to seek larger apartments than they would ordinarily be living in, or to live alone when they would otherwise have to share an apartment with a roommate in order to be able to afford the rent. Some people who do not even live in the same city as their rent-controlled apartment nevertheless keep it as a place to stay when they are visiting the city. Hollywood movie stars who keep rent-controlled apartments in New York, or a couple living in Hawaii who kept a rent-controlled residence in San Francisco, for example. More tenants seeking both more apartments and larger apartments create a shortage, even when there is not any greater physical scarcity of housing relative to the total population. When rent control ended after World War II, the housing shortage quickly disappeared. After rents rose in a free market, some childless couples living in 4-bedroom apartments could decide that they would live in 2-bedroom apartments and save the difference in rent. Some late teenagers could decide that they would continue living with their parents a little longer, until their pay rose enough for them to be able to afford their own apartment, now that rent was no longer artificially cheap. The net result was that families looking for a place to stay found more places available, now that rent control laws were no longer keeping such places occupied by people with less urgent requirements. In other words, the housing shortage immediately eased, even before there was time for new housing to be built, in response to market conditions that now made it possible to recover the cost of building more housing and earn a profit. Just as price fluctuations allocate scarce resources which have alternative uses, price controls which limit those fluctuations reduce the incentives for individuals to limit their own use of scarce resources desired by others. Rent control, for example, tends to lead to many apartments being occupied by just one person. A study in San Francisco showed that 49% of that city's rent-controlled apartments had only a single occupant, while a severe housing shortage in the city had thousands of people living considerable distances away and making long commutes to their jobs in San Francisco. Meanwhile, a census report showed likewise that 46% of all households in Manhattan, where nearly half of all apartments are under some form of rent control, are occupied by only one person, compared to 27% nationwide. In the normal course of events, people's demand for housing space changes over a lifetime. Their demand for space usually increases when they get married and have children. But years later, after the children have grown up and moved away, the parents' demand for space may decline, and it often declines yet again after a spouse dies, and the widow or widower moves into smaller quarters, or goes to live with relatives, or in an institution for the elderly. In this way, a society's total stock of housing is shared and circulated among people according to their changing individual demands at different stages of their lives. This sharing takes place not because the individuals themselves have a sense of cooperation, but because of the prices, rents in this case, which confront them. In a free market, these prices are based on the value that other tenants put on housing. Young couples with a growing family are often willing to bid more for housing, even if that means buying fewer consumer goods and services in order to have enough money to pay for additional housing space. A couple who begin to have children may cut back on how often they go out to restaurants or to movies, or they may wait longer to buy new clothes or a new car in order that each child may have his or her own bedroom. But once the children are grown and gone, such sacrifices may no longer make sense, when additional other amenities can now be enjoyed by reducing the amount of housing space being rented. Given the crucial role of prices in this process, suppression of that process by rent control laws leaves few incentives for tenants to change their behavior as their circumstances change. Elderly people, for example, have less incentive to vacate apartments that they would normally vacate when their children are gone, or after a spouse dies, if that would result in a significant reduction in rent, leaving them more money with which to improve their living standards in other respects. Moreover, the chronic housing shortages which accompany rent control greatly increase the time and effort required to search for a new and smaller apartment while reducing the financial reward for finding one. In short, rent control reduces the rate of housing turnover. New York City has had rent control longer and more stringently than any other major American city. One consequence has been that the annual rate of turnover of apartments in New York is less than half the national average, and the proportion of tenants who have lived in the same apartment for 20 years is more than double the national average. As the New York Times summarized the situation, New York used to be like other cities, a place where tenants moved frequently and landlords competed to rent empty apartments to newcomers. But today, the motto may as well be, no immigrants need apply. While immigrants are crowded into bunks in illegal boarding houses in the slums, upper middle-class locals pay low rents to live in good neighborhoods, often in large apartments they no longer need after their children move out. Supply under rent control. Rent control has effects on supply as well as on demand. 9 years after the end of World War II, not a single new apartment building had been built in Melbourne, Australia, because of rent control laws there, which made such buildings unprofitable. In Egypt, rent control was imposed in 1960. An Egyptian woman who lived through that era wrote about it in 2006, reported, "The end result was that people stopped investing in apartment buildings, and a huge shortage in rentals and housing forced many Egyptians to live in horrible conditions, with several families sharing one small apartment. The effects of the harsh rent control is still felt today in Egypt. Mistakes like that can last for generations." Declines in building construction have likewise followed in the wake of rent control laws elsewhere. After rent control was instituted in Santa Monica, California in 1979, building permits declined to less than 1/10 of what they were just 5 years earlier. A housing study in San Francisco found that 3/4 of its rent-controlled housing was more than half a century old, and 44% of it was more than 70 years old. Although the construction of office buildings, factories, warehouses, and other commercial and industrial buildings requires much of the same kind of labor and materials used to construct apartment buildings, it is not uncommon for many new office buildings to be constructed in cities where very few new apartment buildings are built. Rent control laws often do not apply to industrial or commercial buildings. Thus, even in cities with severe housing shortages, there may be much vacant space in commercial and industrial buildings. Despite a severe housing shortage in New York, San Francisco, and other cities with rent control, a nationwide survey in 2003 found the vacancy rates in buildings used by business and industry to be nearly 12%, the highest in more than 2 decades. This is just one more piece of evidence that the housing shortages are a price phenomenon. High vacancy rates in commercial buildings show that there are obviously ample resources available to construct buildings, but rent control keeps those resources from being used to construct apartments, and thereby diverts these resources into constructing office buildings, industrial plants, and other commercial properties. Not only is the supply of new apartment construction less after rent control laws are imposed, even the supply of existing housing tends to decline as landlords provide less maintenance and repair under rent control, since the housing shortage makes it unnecessary for them to maintain the appearance of their premises in order to attract tenants. Thus, housing tends to deteriorate faster under rent control, and to have fewer replacements when it wears out. Studies of rent control in the United States, England, and France have found rent-controlled housing to be deteriorated far more often than non-rent-controlled housing. Typically, the rental housing stock is relatively fixed in the short run, so that a shortage occurs first because more people want more housing at the artificially low price. Later, there may be a real increase in scarcity as well, as rental units deteriorate more rapidly with reduced maintenance, while not enough new units are being built to replace them as they wear out, because new, privately built housing can be unprofitable under rent control. Under rent control in England and Wales, for example, privately built rental housing fell from being 61% of all housing in 1947 to being just 14% by 1977. A study of rent control in various countries concluded new investment in private unsubsidized rented housing is essentially non-existent in all the European countries surveyed, except for luxury housing. In short, a policy intended to make housing affordable for the poor has had the net effect of shifting resources toward the building of housing that is affordable only by the affluent or the rich, since luxury housing is often exempt from rent control, just as office buildings and other commercial properties are. Among other things, this illustrates the crucial importance of making a distinction between intentions and consequences. Economic policies need to be analyzed in terms of the incentives they create, rather than the hopes that inspired them. The incentives towards a reduced supply of housing under rent control are especially pronounced when people who have been renting out rooms or apartments in their own homes or bungalows in their backyards decide that it is no longer worth the bother when rents are kept artificially low under rent control laws. In addition, there are often conversions of apartments to condominiums. During 8 years of rent control in Washington during the 1970s, that city's available rental housing stock declined absolutely, from just over 199,000 units on the market to just under 176,000 units. After rent control was introduced in Berkeley, California, the numbers of private rental housing units available to students at the university there declined by 31% in 5 years. None of this should be surprising, given the incentives created by rent control laws. In terms of incentives, it is likewise easy to understand what happened in England when rent control was extended in 1975 to cover furnished rental units. According to The Times of London, advertisements for furnished rented accommodation in the London Evening Standard plummeted dramatically in the first week after the Act came into force and are now running at about 75% below last year's levels. Since furnished rooms are often in people's homes, these represent housing units that are easily withdrawn from the market when the rents no longer compensate for the inconveniences of having renters living with you. The same principle applies where there are small apartment buildings, like duplexes, where the owner is also one of the tenants. Within 3 years after rent control was imposed in Toronto in 1976, 23% of all rental units in owner-occupied dwellings were withdrawn from the housing market. Even when rent control applies to apartment buildings where the landlord does not live, eventually the point may be reached where the whole building becomes sufficiently unprofitable that it is simply abandoned. In New York City, for example, many buildings have been abandoned after their owners found it impossible to collect enough rent to cover the costs of services that they are required by law to provide, such as heat and hot water. Such owners have simply disappeared in order to escape the legal consequences of their abandonment, and such buildings often end up vacant and boarded up, though still physically sound enough to house people if they continue to be maintained and repaired. The number of abandoned buildings taken over by the New York City government over the years runs into the thousands. It has been estimated that there are at least 4 times as many abandoned housing units in New York City as there are homeless people living on the streets there. Homelessness is not due to a physical scarcity of housing, but to a price-related shortage, which is painfully real nonetheless. As of 2013, there were more than 47,000 homeless people in New York City. 20,000 of them were children. Such inefficiency in the allocation of resources means that people are sleeping outdoors on the pavement on cold winter nights, some dying of exposure, while the means of housing them already exist, but are not being used because of laws designed to make housing affordable. Once again, this demonstrates that the efficient or inefficient allocation of scarce resources is not just some abstract notion of economists, but has very real consequences, which can even include matters of life and death. It also illustrates that the goal of a law, affordable housing in this case, tells us nothing about its actual consequences. The politics of rent control. Politically, rent control is often a big success, however many serious economic and social problems it creates. Politicians know that there are always more tenants than landlords, and more people who do not understand economics than people who do. That makes rent control laws something likely to lead to a net increase in votes for politicians who pass rent control laws. Often it is politically effective to represent rent control as a way to keep greedy rich landlords from gouging the poor with unconscionable rents. In reality, rates of return on investments in housing are seldom higher than on alternative investments, and landlords are often people of very modest means. This is especially so for owners of small, low-end apartment buildings that are in constant need of repair, the kinds of places where tenants are likely to be low-income people. Many of the landlords with buildings like this are handymen who use their own skills and labor as carpenters or plumbers to repair and maintain the premises, while trying to pay off the mortgage with the rents they collect. In short, the kind of housing likely to be rented by the poor often has owners who are by no means rich. Footnote. My wife was once an attorney for a non-profit organization that often represented tenants in disputes with landlords. After observing how often the landlords were people of obviously modest economic and educational levels, she began to rethink the assumptions that led her into supporting rent control and its accompanying housing regulations. End footnote. Where rent control laws apply on a blanket basis to all housing in existence as of the time the law goes into effect, even luxurious housing becomes low-rent housing. Then, after the passage of time makes clear that no new housing is likely to be built unless it is exempted from rent control, such exemptions or relaxations of rent control for new housing mean that even new apartments that are very modest in size and quality may rent for far more than older, more spacious, and more luxurious apartments that are still under rent control. This non-comparability of rents has been common in European cities under rent control, as well as in New York and other American cities. Similar incentives produce similar results in many different settings. A news story in the Wall Street Journal pointed up this non-comparability of rents under New York City's rent control laws. Les Katz, a 27-year-old acting student and doorman, rents a small studio apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side for $1,200, with 2 roommates. 2 sleep in separate beds in a loft built atop the kitchen, the third on a mattress in the main room. Across town on Park Avenue, Paul Haberman, a private investor, and his wife live in a spacious 2-bedroom apartment with a solarium and 2 terraces. The apartment, in an elegant building on the prestigious avenue, is worth at least $5,000 a month, real estate professionals say. The couples pay around $350, according to rent records. This example of cheap rent for the affluent or the wealthy under rent control was by no means unique. Ironically, a statistical study indicated that the biggest difference between prices under New York's rent control law and free market prices is in luxury apartments. In other words, the affluent and the wealthy get more economic benefit from rent control than do the poor who are invoked to justify such laws. Meanwhile, city welfare agencies have paid much higher rents than those just mentioned when they housed poverty-stricken families in cramped and roach-infested apartments in rundown hotels. In 2013, the New York Times reported that the city's Department of Homeless Services was spending over $3,000 a month for each threadbare room without a bathroom or kitchen in a single-room occupancy hotel, half of that money going to the landlord for rent and the other half for security and social services for homeless tenants. The image that rent control protects poor tenants from rich landlords may be politically effective, but often it bears little resemblance to the reality. The people who actually benefit from rent control can be at any income level, and so can those who lose out. It depends on who happens to be on the inside looking out, and who happens to be on the outside looking in when such laws are passed. San Francisco's rent control laws are not as old as those in New York City, but they are similarly severe and have produced very similar results. A study published in 2001 showed that more than 1/4 of the occupants of rent-controlled apartments in San Francisco had household incomes of more than $100,000 a year. It should also be noted that this was the first empirical study of rent control commissioned by the city of San Francisco. Since rent control began there in 1979, this means that for more than 2 decades, These laws were enforced and extended, with no serious attempt being made to measure their actual economic and social consequences, as distinguished from their political popularity. Ironically, cities with strong rent control laws, such as New York and San Francisco, tend to end up with higher average rents than cities without rent control. Where such laws apply only to rents below some specified level, presumably to protect the poor, builders then have incentives to build only apartments luxurious enough to be priced above the rent control level. Not surprisingly, this leads to higher average rents, and homelessness tends to be greater in cities with rent control. New York and San Francisco, again, being classic examples. One of the reasons for the political success of rent control laws is that many people accept words as indicators of reality. They believe that rent control laws actually control rents. So long as they believe that, such laws are politically viable, as are other laws that proclaim some apparently desirable goals, whether those goals end up being served or not. Scarcity versus shortage. One of the crucial distinctions to keep in mind is the distinction between an increased scarcity, where fewer goods are available relative to the population, and a shortage as a price phenomenon. Just as there can be a growing shortage without an increased scarcity, so there can be a growing scarcity without a shortage. As already noted, there was a severe housing shortage in the United States during and immediately after the Second World War, even though the ratio of housing to people was the same as it had been before the war, when there was no housing shortage. It is also possible to have the opposite situation, where the actual amount of housing suddenly declines in a given area without any price control, and without any shortage. This happened in the wake of the Great San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. More than half the city's housing supply was destroyed in just 3 days during that catastrophe. Yet there was no housing shortage. When the San Francisco Chronicle resumed publication a month after the earthquake, its first issue contained 64 advertisements of apartments or homes for rent, compared to only 5 ads from people seeking apartments to live in. Of the 200,000 people suddenly made homeless by the earthquake and fire, temporary shelters housed 30,000, and an estimated 75,000 left the city. Still, that left nearly 100,000 people to be absorbed into the local housing market. Yet the newspapers of that time mention no housing shortage. Rising prices not only allocate existing housing, they provide incentives for rebuilding and for renters to use less space in the meantime, as well as incentives for those with space in their homes to take in roomers while rents are high. In short, just as there can be a shortage without any greater physical scarcity, so there can be a greater physical scarcity without any shortage. People made homeless by the huge 1906 San Francisco earthquake found housing more readily than people made homeless by New York's rent control laws that took thousands of buildings off the market. Hoarding. In addition to shortages and quality deterioration under price controls, there is often hoarding. That is, individuals keeping a larger inventory of the price-controlled goods than they would ordinarily under free market conditions, because of the uncertainty of being able to find it in the future. Thus, during the gasoline shortages of the 1970s, motorists were less likely to let their gas tanks get down as low as usual before going to a filling station to buy more gas. Some motorists, with their tanks half full, would drive into any filling station that happened to have gas and fill up the other half as a precaution. With millions of motorists driving around with their gas tanks more full than usual, vast amounts of gasoline disappeared into individual inventories, leaving less available for sale from the general inventory at filling stations. Thus, a relatively small shortage of gasoline nationally could turn into a very serious problem for those motorists who happened to run out of gas and had to look for a filling station that was open and had gas to sell. The sudden severity of the gasoline shortage, given how little difference there was in the total amount of gasoline produced, baffled many people and produced various conspiracy theories. One of these conspiracy theories was that oil companies had their tankers from the Middle East circling around in the ocean, waiting for a price increase before coming ashore with their cargoes. Although none of these conspiracy theories stood up under scrutiny, there was a kernel of sense behind them, as there usually is behind most fallacies. A severe shortage of gasoline, with very little difference in the total amount of gasoline produced, meant that there had to be a large amount of gasoline being diverted somewhere. Few of those who created or believed conspiracy theories suspected that the excess was being stored in their own gas tanks, rather than in oil tankers circling in the ocean. This increased the severity of the gasoline shortage because maintaining millions of larger individual inventories of gasoline in cars and trucks was less efficient than maintaining general inventories in filling stations' storage tanks. The feasibility of hoarding varies with different goods, so the effect of price controls also varies. For example, price controls on strawberries might lead to less of a shortage than price controls on gasoline, since strawberries are too perishable to be hoarded for long. Price controls on haircuts or other services may also create less of a shortage, because services cannot be hoarded. That is, you would not get two haircuts on the same day if you found a barber with time available, in order to go twice as long before the next haircut, even though barbers might be less available when the price of haircuts was kept down by price controls. Nevertheless, some unlikely things do get hoarded under price controls. For example, under rent control, people may keep an apartment that they seldom use, as some Hollywood stars have kept rent-controlled apartments in Manhattan, where they would stay when visiting New York. Mayor Ed Koch kept his rent-controlled apartment during the entire 12 years when he lived in Gracie Mansion, the official residence of New York's mayor. In 2008, it was revealed that New York Congressman Charles Rangel had 4 rent-controlled apartments, one of which he used as an office. Hoarding is a special case of the more general economic principle that more is demanded at a lower price, and of the corollary that price controls allow lower priority uses to preempt higher priority uses, increasing the severity of the shortages, whether of apartments or gasoline. Sometimes the reduction in supply under price controls takes forms that are less obvious. Under World War II price controls, Consumer Reports magazine found that 19 out of 20 candy bars that it tested in 1943 were smaller in size than they had been 4 years earlier. Some producers of canned foods let the quality deteriorate, but then sold these lower quality foods under a different label in order to preserve the reputation of their regular brand. Black markets. While price controls make it illegal for buyer and seller to make some transactions on terms that they would both prefer to the shortages that price controls entail, bolder and less scrupulous buyers and sellers make mutually advantageous transactions outside the law. Price controls almost invariably produce black markets, where prices are not only higher than the legally permitted prices, but also higher than they would be in a free market, since the legal risks must also be compensated. While small-scale black markets may function in secrecy, large-scale black markets usually require bribes to officials to look the other way. In Russia, for example, a local embargo on the shipment of price-controlled food beyond regional boundaries was dubbed the 150-ruble decree, since this was the cost of bribing police to let the shipments pass through checkpoints. Even during the early Soviet period, when operating a black market in food was punishable by death, black markets still existed. As 2 Soviet economists of a later era put it, even at the height of war communism, speculators and food smugglers at the risk of their lives brought as much grain into the cities as all the state purchases made under Prodrazverska. Apologies. Statistics on black market activity are by nature elusive, since no one wants to let the whole world know they are violating the law. However, sometimes there are indirect indications. Under American wartime price controls during and immediately after the Second World War, employment in meat-packing plants declined as meat was diverted from legitimate packing houses into black markets. This often translated into empty meat counters in butcher shops and grocery stores. Footnote. In many cases, goods in short supply were kept in the back of the store for sale to those people who were willing to offer more than the legal price. Black markets were not always separate operations, but were also a sideline of some otherwise legitimate businesses. End footnote. As in other cases, however, this was not due simply to an actual physical scarcity of meat, but to its diversion into illegal channels. Within 1 month after price controls were ended, employment in meatpacking plants rose from 93,000 to 163,000, and then rose again to 180,000 over the next 2 months. This nearly doubling of employment in meatpacking plants in just 3 months indicated that meat was clearly no longer being diverted from the packing houses after price controls were ended. In the Soviet Union, where price controls were more pervasive and longer lasting, 2 Soviet economists wrote of a gray market, where people paid additional money for goods and services. Although these illegal transactions are not taken into account by official statistics, the Soviet economists estimated that 83% of the population used these forbidden economic channels. These illegal markets covered a wide range of transactions, including almost half of the repair of apartments, 40% of automobile repairs, and more video sales than in the legal markets. The black market trades almost 10,000 video titles, while the state market offers fewer than 1,000. Quality deterioration. One of the reasons for the political success of price controls is that part of their costs are concealed. Even the visible shortages do not tell the whole story. Quality deterioration, such as already noted in the case of housing, has been common with many other products and services whose prices have been kept artificially low by government fiat. One of the fundamental problems of price control is defining just what it is whose price is being controlled. Even something as simple as an apple is not easy to define because apples differ in size, freshness, and appearance, quite aside from the different varieties of apples. Produce stores and supermarkets spend time, and hence money, sorting out different kinds and qualities of apples, throwing away those that fall below a certain quality that their respective customers expect. Under price control, however, the amount of apples demanded at an artificially low price exceeds the amount supplied, so there's no need to spend so much time and money sorting out apples, as they will all be sold anyway. Some apples that would ordinarily be thrown away under free market conditions may, under price control, be kept for sale to those people who arrive after all the good apples have been sold. As with apartments under rent control, there is less incentive to maintain high quality when everything will sell anyway during a shortage. Some of the most painful examples of quality deterioration have occurred in countries where there are price controls on medical care. At artificially low prices, more people go to doctors' offices with minor ailments, like sniffles or skin rashes, that they might otherwise ignore, or else might treat with the over-the-counter medications, perhaps with a pharmacist's advice. But all this changes when price controls reduce the cost of visits to the doctor's office, and especially when these visits are paid for by the government and are therefore free to the patient. In short, more people make more claims on doctors' time under price control, leaving less time for other people with more serious or even urgent medical problems. Thus, under Britain's government-controlled medical system, a 12-year-old girl was given a breast implant, while 10,000 people waited 15 months or more for surgery. A woman with cancer had her operation postponed so many times that the malignancy eventually became inoperable. The priorities which prices automatically cause individuals to consider are among the first casualties of price controls. A study conducted by the International Agency Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found that among 5 English-speaking countries surveyed, only in the United States was the percentage of patients waiting for elective surgery for more than 4 months in single digits. All the other English-speaking countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, had more than 20% of their patients waiting more than 4 months, with 38% of those in the United Kingdom waiting at least that long. In this group, the United States was the only country without government-set prices for medical treatment. Incidentally, the term elective surgery was not confined to cosmetic surgery or other medically unnecessary procedures, but in this study included cataract surgery, hip replacement, and coronary bypass surgery. Delayed medical treatment is one aspect of quality deterioration when prices are set below the levels that would prevail under supply and demand. The quality of the treatment received is also affected when doctors spend less time per patient. In countries around the world, the amount of time that physicians spend per patient visit has been shorter under government-controlled medical care prices compared to the time spent by physicians where prices are not controlled. Black markets are another common feature of price controls that apply to medical care as to other things. In China and Japan, black markets have taken the form of bribes to doctors to get expedited treatment. In short, whether the product or service has been housing, apples, or medical care, quality deterioration under price control has been common in the most disparate settings.